The sterile fluorescence of the car dealership's showroom cast sharp reflections on the polished floors, glinting off the sleek curves of luxury vehicles lined up like trophies. It was a place where wealth was flaunted, where deals were struck with handshakes and egos were stroked with compliments. But on this particular evening, the air was thick with tension, not commerce. The billionaire, a man whose name was synonymous with power and privilege, stood at the center of the showroom, his tailored suit pristine but his face contorted with rage. His pregnant wife, her hand protectively cradling her swollen belly, stood opposite him, her expression a mix of defiance and fear. The argument had started quietly, a private exchange of sharp words, but it had escalated quickly, spiraling into something ugly and public. Then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time, his hand lashed out, striking her across the face with a slap that echoed through the cavernous space. Gasps rippled through the small crowd of onlookers, salespeople, customers, and a few curious passers-by who had wandered in. The dealership manager, a towering figure with a military bearing, emerged from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing with a fury that was both professional and deeply personal. He was her cousin, an Army Ranger veteran whose calm demeanor masked a readiness for action. This wasn't just a workplace incident for him, it was family. The billionaire, let's call him Richard, was no stranger to controversy. His fortune, built on a sprawling empire of tech ventures and real estate, had made him untouchable in many circles. He was a man who thrived on control, whether it was over boardrooms or his personal life. His wife, Emily, was younger, a former model whose beauty had once graced magazine covers but who now carried the weight of a marriage strained by power imbalances. She was 6 months pregnant, her pregnancy a source of both joy and vulnerability. The argument that led to the slap had roots in a simmering dispute, rumors of Richard's infidelity, his late nights at the office, and his growing impatience with Emily's increasing independence. She had begun to push back, to question his decisions, to demand more than the gilded cage he offered. Tonight, at the dealership, the tension had boiled over. They had come to the dealership to pick up a custom-ordered sports car, a six-figure status symbol Richard had insisted on buying despite Emily's protests that it was impractical for their growing family. The dealership, one of the most exclusive in the city, was a place where Richard felt at home, surrounded by luxury and deference. Emily, however, had grown weary of these displays of wealth. She had arrived separately, her own car parked haphazardly outside, a sign of her haste and agitation. The conversation started civilly enough, with Richard admiring the car's sleek lines and Emily offering tepid approval. But then she mentioned selling one of his other cars to make room in their crowded garage, a suggestion that hit a nerve. Richard's voice rose, accusing her of undermining him, of not appreciating the life he provided. Emily, her hormones and emotions heightened by pregnancy, snapped back, her words sharp and unyielding. She mentioned a name, a woman's name, one linked to the rumors, and Richard's face darkened. That's when his hand moved, faster than anyone could anticipate, leaving a red mark on Emily's cheek. The slap was a violation, not just of Emily but of the unspoken rules of civility that governed even the most dysfunctional of elite circles. The onlookers froze, their shock palpable. A salesperson dropped his clipboard, a customer's phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. But the manager, Michael, reacted differently. He moved with the precision of a man trained for crisis, his broad shoulders cutting through the crowd as he closed the distance between himself and Richard. Michael was Emily's cousin, a fact known to few in the room. He had served 2 tours as an Army Ranger, his body and mind honed by years of discipline and danger. Now, managing a dealership was his civilian life, but the instincts of a soldier never left him. His presence was imposing, his eyes locked on Richard with an intensity that made the billionaire take a step back. Get your hands off her, Michael said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a command. It wasn't a request, it was an order, issued with the authority of someone who had faced far worse than a temperamental tycoon. Richard, unused to being challenged, scoffed, his arrogance undeterred. This is none of your business, he spat, straightening his tie as if to reassert his dominance. But Michael didn't budge. He positioned himself between Richard and Emily, his body a shield. Emily, tears welling but her jaw set, touched Michael's arm, a silent plea for him to stay calm. She knew her cousin's temper, knew the stories of his missions overseas, the ones he rarely spoke of but that had left scars both visible and hidden. The dealership staff, sensing the situation spiraling, began to usher customers toward the exits, their voices strained with forced politeness. But the scene was already drawing attention. Phones were out, recording, the soft clicks of cameras punctuating the silence. Richard, aware of the growing audience, tried to pivot, his tone shifting to one of false contrition. Let's not make a scene, he said, addressing Emily but glancing at Michael. We'll talk at home. Emily shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. I'm not going anywhere with you. It was a declaration of defiance, one that seemed to catch Richard off guard. He was used to her compliance, her willingness to smooth over his outbursts for the sake of appearances. But tonight, something had shifted. Michael's presence emboldened her. He had always been her protector, even as children. Growing up, they had been close, their families intertwined despite the differences in their paths. Michael had chosen the military, a life of service, while Emily had been swept into the world of glamour and wealth. But their bond remained, a quiet understanding that transcended their circumstances. When Michael took the job at the dealership, Emily had been thrilled, knowing he was nearby. Now, as he stood between her and Richard, that bond felt like a lifeline. Richard's eyes darted between them, calculating. He was a man who thrived on leverage, and he sensed he was losing it. You're making a mistake, he said to Emily, his voice laced with a threat that didn't need to be explicit. But Michael stepped closer, his height and build making Richard's tailored suit and polished demeanor seem almost comical in comparison. The mistake was yours, Michael said, his words clipped. You don't touch her. Ever. The standoff was electric, the air charged with the potential for violence. The staff, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, hovered nervously, unsure whether to call security or the police. Emily, still reeling from the slap, felt a surge of clarity. She had spent years navigating Richard's temper, his need for control, his subtle and not so subtle cruelties. The pregnancy had changed her, given her a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for the child she carried. I'm done, she said, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. I'm leaving you. The words hung in the air, a declaration that felt both liberating and terrifying. Richard's face twisted, a mix of shock and rage, but before he could respond, Michael spoke again. You heard her. It's time for you to go. Richard hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. He was a billionaire, a man who could buy his way out of most problems, but this wasn't a boardroom. The optics were disastrous, and he knew it. Phones were still recording, and the story was already spreading beyond the showroom. With a final glare at Emily and Michael, he turned and strode toward the exit, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The crowd parted, their whispers following him out the door. Michael turned to Emily, his expression softening. You okay? He asked, his voice gentle now. She nodded, though her hand still rested on her cheek, the sting of the slap lingering. I will be, she said, her eyes meeting his. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that she could reclaim her life. Michael guided her to a chair, his hand steady on her shoulder. The dealership staff, now bustling to restore order, gave them space, their respect for Michael evident in their quick compliance. Outside, the night was cool, the city lights casting a glow over the dealership's glass facade. Richard's car peeled out of the lot, the roar of the engine a final act of defiance. But inside, Emily sat with Michael, the weight of her decision settling over her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, Richard's wealth and influence would make leaving him a battle. But with her cousin by her side, a man who had faced wars and emerged unbroken, she felt ready to fight. The slap had been a breaking point, but it was also a beginning, a moment that would redefine her future. The incident at the car dealership had already set tongues wagging across the city, but the revelation that the manager was the pregnant wife's Army Ranger cousin added a layer of complexity that turned the scandal into a full-blown spectacle. The billionaire, Charles Warrington, was a man whose name carried weight. His empire of tech startups and real estate ventures had made him a fixture in the headlines, often for his ruthless business tactics and ostentatious lifestyle. But this time, the story wasn't about a hostile takeover or a flashy new acquisition. It was personal, raw, and ugly, and it unfolded in the glossy showroom of a luxury car dealership on a crisp autumn afternoon. The dealership, Elite Motors, was a cathedral of wealth, its polished floors reflecting the gleam of high-end vehicles that cost more than most people's homes. Charles had arrived with his wife, Evelyn, who was 6 months pregnant with their first child. The couple was there to pick up a custom-ordered Bentley, a purchase meant to celebrate the impending arrival of their heir. Evelyn, radiant despite the strain of pregnancy, had been quieter than usual that day, her eyes darting nervously as Charles strode through the showroom like he owned it. To the staff, he was the kind of customer who demanded attention, his voice sharp, his demeanor impatient. But no one could have predicted how quickly things would spiral. The altercation began over something trivial, a delay in the paperwork, a minor scratch on the Bentley's hood, accounts varied. Charles, known for his temper, erupted when the manager, a broad-shouldered man named Daniel Harper, explained that the car needed a final inspection before delivery. Witnesses later described Charles's voice rising, his face reddening as he jabbed a finger at Daniel, accusing him of incompetence. Evelyn, standing nearby, tried to intervene, her voice soft but firm, urging her husband to calm down. That's when it happened. In a moment of unchecked rage, Charles spun toward her, his hand connecting with her cheek in a sharp, audible slap. The showroom fell silent, the air thick with shock. Evelyn stumbled back, her hand instinctively cradling her swollen belly, her eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel, who had been maintaining a professional composure despite Charles's tirade, froze for a split second before stepping forward. His military training was evident in his controlled movements, but the fury in his eyes was unmistakable. "You don't touch her," he said, his voice low and dangerous. It wasn't until later that the stunned onlookers learned Daniel wasn't just the dealership manager, he was Evelyn's cousin, a former Army Ranger who had served multiple tours overseas and carried the quiet intensity of someone who had seen too much. The connection between them wasn't widely known. Daniel had kept his family ties private, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But in that moment, the familial bond was clear, and it changed everything. Charles, perhaps realizing the gravity of his actions, tried to backtrack, muttering something about stress and apologies, but Daniel wasn't having it. He positioned himself between Charles and Evelyn, his stance protective, his gaze unwavering. "Get out," he said, pointing toward the door. The billionaire, unused to being challenged, hesitated, his ego warring with the reality of the situation. Customers and staff watched, some reaching for their phones, others whispering to one another. The scene was already being recorded, snippets destined to go viral within hours. Charles eventually stormed out, leaving Evelyn behind, her face pale but composed as she leaned on Daniel for support. The aftermath was chaotic. By evening, the incident was trending on X, with videos circulating under hashtags like #Billionaire slaps wife and #car dealership drama. Posts speculated wildly about the couple's relationship, Charles's temper, and the mysterious manager who had stepped in. When it emerged that Daniel was Evelyn's cousin, the narrative exploded further. X users dug into his background, uncovering his military service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart, and a reputation for discipline and loyalty. Suddenly, he wasn't just a manager, he was a hero, the stoic defender of his pregnant cousin against a powerful, abusive husband. The public ate it up, painting Charles as the villain and Daniel as the embodiment of justice. Evelyn, meanwhile, became the focal point of sympathy and scrutiny. Paparazzi camped outside her mansion, hoping for a glimpse of her or a statement. She remained silent, but sources close to her began leaking details to tabloids. They claimed the slap wasn't an isolated incident. Charles's controlling nature had been a constant in their marriage, his public charm masking a volatile temper behind closed doors. Evelyn, they said, had stayed for the sake of their unborn child and the financial security Charles's wealth provided. But the public humiliation at the dealership was a breaking point. Rumors swirled that she was consulting divorce lawyers, though no official confirmation came. Daniel's role in the saga grew larger as more details emerged. He had taken a job at Elite Motors after leaving the military, seeking a quieter life but never losing the instincts honed in combat. His decision to confront Charles wasn't just about family loyalty, it was personal. He had seen Evelyn's slow transformation over the years, from a vibrant, independent woman to someone subdued by her husband's dominance. When Charles raised his hand, Daniel's response was visceral, rooted in a promise he'd made to protect his cousin after their shared childhood in a tight-knit family. The media latched onto this, portraying him as a modern-day knight, though Daniel himself avoided interviews, letting his actions speak. The legal fallout was swift. Evelyn filed a restraining order against Charles, citing emotional and physical abuse. The billionaire hired a top-tier legal team, issuing a public apology that many dismissed as damage control. "I deeply regret my actions," his statement read, blaming a momentary lapse on business pressures. The apology did little to quell the outrage. Activists on X called for boycotts of his companies, while feminist groups rallied around Evelyn, framing her story as a stark reminder of domestic abuse's reach, even among the elite. Charles's business partners began distancing themselves, wary of the PR nightmare. At the dealership, Daniel faced his own challenges. His confrontation with Charles had made him a local celebrity, but it also put his job at risk. Elite Motors owners, wary of antagonizing a billionaire, initially considered suspending him, citing workplace conduct policies. But public support for Daniel was overwhelming. Petitions circulated online, demanding he keep his position, and customers flooded the dealership with positive reviews praising his integrity. The owners relented, realizing that firing him would only fuel the backlash. Daniel, for his part, stayed focused on Evelyn, ensuring she had a safe place to stay and coordinating with her legal team. As weeks passed, the story evolved. Evelyn's pregnancy became a symbol of hope and resilience, with strangers sending her messages of support. She began speaking out, not through press conferences but through a carefully worded post on X, thanking Daniel and affirming her commitment to her child's future. "I am not defined by one moment," she wrote, "but by the strength I find moving forward." The post garnered millions of likes, with many praising her courage. Daniel, too, gained a following, though he remained private, uncomfortable with the hero label. Charles, meanwhile, faced mounting consequences. His board of directors pressured him to step back from his CEO role, citing reputational damage. Investors pulled funding from his latest venture, and his social circle shrank as former allies avoided him. The slap had exposed not just his temper but the fragility of his carefully curated image. Rumors surfaced that Evelyn's legal team was preparing to demand a significant portion of his fortune in a divorce settlement, potentially reshaping the billionaire landscape. The dealership incident, once a fleeting moment of violence, had become a cultural flashpoint. It sparked debates about wealth, power, and accountability, with Daniel's military background and familial loyalty adding a layer of heroism to the narrative. For Evelyn, it was a painful but liberating turning point, a chance to reclaim her voice. For Charles, it was a fall from grace, a reminder that even billions couldn't shield him from consequences. And for Daniel, it was a moment of truth, where duty to family outweighed everything else, proving that some bonds run deeper than wealth or status.